Hi, welcome to Miss Richardson's U.S. History 5-Minute Lectures. This information is U.S. Notes 5.19, The Vietnam War Ends. It includes information that goes along with the second section on your study guide. Now remember to use your study guide to help you take the notes and figure out what's important. You have control, so pause if you need to and rewind if you need to. And if you have any questions at all, bring those to class and we'll talk about them. Let's go ahead and get started. As you learned in the last set of notes, the U.S. began to back off their plans in Vietnam starting in 1970. This began a period of better relations between the U.S. and North Vietnam. This period of eased tensions is known as détente. The relaxation of political tensions between the two countries lasted from 1970 to 1972. During this time, President Nixon and his Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, sought stability and a balance of power in Vietnam. Rather than focus on war and winning, they shifted to a more diplomatic approach and controlled foreign affairs from the White House, not from the battlefield. This relaxation of political tensions also translated into lesser tensions with the Soviet Union and China. So we actually had a détente with those two countries as well. These better diplomatic relations ultimately led to a withdrawal of U.S. troops from Vietnam. In October of 1972, a ceasefire agreement was signed between the U.S. and North Vietnam. In January of 73, the two countries signed a peace agreement. And by the end of March 1973, all U.S. combat troops had left Vietnam, effectively ending the American ground war in Vietnam. Now, there were still some U.S. diplomats and ambassadors who were stationed in South Vietnam, in Saigon, following the peace agreement, but no combat troops. Also in 1973, Congress passed what was known as the War Powers Act of 1973. This act undid the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. So essentially, Congress decided that the president's power to commit troops to combat without their approval gave the president way too much power. So they wanted to change that, and they canceled it. Under the War Powers Act, the president can still commit troops to a hostile situation. However, he must notify Congress within 48 hours of this action that he does. Also, any troops who are sent may not stay overseas for more than 60 days, without congressional approval, and if Congress wants to, they can demand the return of military troops to the U.S. So this puts many more limits on the president's war powers than what were given to President Johnson in 1964 with the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. So following the passage of the War Powers Act, in 1974, there was the Watergate scandal, and we will talk about that in part 3 of the unit. I promise, not leaving it out. But that Watergate scandal forced President Nixon to resign in 1974, and his vice president, Gerald Ford, became president. Ford was the last U.S. president involved in the Vietnam War, and he was also the last U.S. president until Clinton in the 90s to have any real dealings with Vietnam. Clinton actually is the next one to go visit there. So though we had a peace agreement with North Vietnam, and the U.S. had withdrawn troops on March 9, 1975, the North Vietnamese armies attacked South Vietnam. So they easily defeated the unprepared South, and they continued fighting their way south, winning over and over again with very little resistance. So the North Vietnamese decided to take over the entire country. In April of 1975, North Vietnam succeeded in unifying Vietnam into one Vietnam. So shortly after the surrender of the South, the Cambodians also surrendered to the Khmer Rouge, who was a communist as well, and that meant containment had failed in Southeast Asia. Following the fall of the Vietnam government in the South, the last Americans at the embassy had to leave Saigon. So this happened in a very dramatic fashion, which actually was not good for Ford, because this showed up on the news. It happened as the North Vietnamese army was invading and capturing the capital city. So as that happened, the last Americans were evacuated from the U.S. Embassy rooftop by helicopter. And this is the type of picture that showed up in the US. So in the end, all of Vietnam fell to the communist North under Ho Chi Minh. The U.S. efforts to contain communism in Southeast Asia failed, and many Americans viewed the Vietnam War as a failure for the U.S., with huge losses and absolutely no gains. And the Cold War continued. That's the end of 519. Hopefully you learned something, and I will see you in class with your questions.